The barn door scraped open at 5:30 every morning, same as it had for 18 years. Robert pulled the latch, felt the cold metal under his palm, and stepped into the smell of feed grain and old wood. The dairy herd shuffled in their stalls, breath steaming in the November chill. Outside, the valley spread flat and green under a low sky, the river a dark ribbon half a mile south, threading between the fields his grandfather had cleared in 1947. The radio sat on the workbench, its red light glowing, tuned to the farm report. Static crackled between sentences. Robert filled the first bucket, hoisted it, and moved down the row. His wife, Linda, would be up soon, starting coffee in the kitchen. His two sons, Jacob and Liam, would sleep another hour before school. His father-in-law, Frank, lived in the smaller house at the edge of the property, and his sister-in-law, Claire, rented the cottage near the access road. The family had roots here, deep ones, and they all knew the rhythms of the place. Robert had grown up learning those rhythms from his own father, who'd learned them from his. The river had always been there, reliable, predictable, a boundary more than a threat. The land sloped gently toward it, imperceptibly, the kind of grade you only noticed when you walked it with intention, watching how water pooled after rain, where it gathered, where it ran. Every spring brought melt from the mountains. Every summer brought thunderstorms that rolled through the valley like freight trains. Every fall brought the quiet before winter, when the river ran low and clear and you could see the stones on the bottom. Robert knew those patterns. He'd trusted them his whole life. But something had shifted. Robert noticed it first in late September, when the rains started earlier than usual and didn't stop. Not heavy downpours, just steady precipitation, day after day, soaking into everything. The weather reports mentioned a wet season, fronts stacking up over the mountains, cold air clashing with warm moisture from the south. The meteorologists spoke in probabilities and percentages, above-average rainfall, elevated risk, moisture anomalies. Robert listened while he worked, while he milked, while he drove into town for supplies. The river began to rise, not dramatically, just a slow creep up the banks, an inch here, 2 inches there. By mid-October, the water had reached the high water mark from 3 years ago, the line where the grass changed color along the shore, where sediment had been deposited and dried. Robert walked down there one afternoon, stood at the edge, and watched the current. It moved faster than he remembered, thick and brown, carrying branches and debris. He felt the ground underfoot, softer than it should be, saturated. The soil couldn't absorb anymore. It had reached capacity weeks ago. Every new rainfall would run straight to the river, adding to the volume, pushing the level higher. When he got back to the barn, he pulled out the old maps his father had kept in a metal box, maps showing the original survey lines, the old riverbed from before the levees went in during the 50s. The river used to meander wider, cutting through land that was now farmland, settled land, places where houses stood. The levees had constrained it, forced it into a narrower channel, and for decades that had worked. The river had stayed put, predictable, manageable, but levees had limits, and Robert could see those limits approaching. He spread the maps across the workbench, tracing the old flood lines with his finger. His father had marked them in pencil, dates, and water levels, a record spanning 40 years. The highest mark was from 1964, a spring flood that had come within 200 yards of where the barn now stood. That was before Robert was born, before the county had reinforced the levees, before development had pushed closer to the river. The land had changed. More houses meant more runoff, more pavement meant less absorption, more pressure on the system. Wetlands that used to act as natural buffers had been drained and converted to farmland. The forest on the hills had been logged. Every change made the valley less able to handle excess water. Robert folded the maps carefully and put them back in the box. He didn't say anything to anyone yet. He just watched. He measured. He calculated. The radio started mentioning flood warnings a week later. Minor flooding expected in low-lying areas, the announcer said. Residents advised to monitor conditions. The County Emergency Management Office issued a statement urging caution, but emphasizing that the situation was under control, that the levees were holding, that there was no immediate danger. Robert brought it up at dinner that night, casual, testing the temperature. Linda looked up from her plate, Falk paused and said the river had never come close to the house, not in her lifetime, not in her father's. Frank, sitting at the end of the table, grunted agreement. He'd lived through the flood of '82, he said, and that one barely touched the lower pasture. This was nothing, just a wet year. It happened sometimes. The weather would break eventually. Jacob and Liam didn't even look up from their phones, scrolling through whatever held their attention. Claire, visiting for the meal, laughed and said Robert always worried too much, that it was his nature, that he saw catastrophe around every corner. The conversation moved on to other topics: school schedules, repair costs for the tractor, the price of feed. Robert didn't push it, but that night, lying in bed, listening to rain hammer the roof, he couldn't shake the image of those old maps, the way the river used to flow, the way water always finds its path. Sleep came slowly, fragmented by the sound of water rushing through the gutters, overflowing, pooling in the yard. Before you go further, if you're someone who's ever second-guessed a storm warning, or wondered whether that extra prep was overkill, or if you've got a story about floods, rivers, or a time you trusted your gut when no one else did, hit subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. I want to hear your stories. By early November, Robert made a decision. He didn't announce it. He didn't call a family meeting or make a case. He just started. The old flatbed trailer sat behind the barn, rusted but structurally sound, 12 feet long, 6 feet wide. He dragged it into the workshed, cleared space, and began sketching plans on a piece of scrap plywood. A boat, not a raft, not a canoe, but a proper shallow draft utility boat, something that could carry weight, stay stable in current, and hold his family if the water came up. He'd worked boats before, summers on the lake as a teenager, helping his uncle maintain a small fishing fleet. He understood the basics: displacement, stability, freeboard. He knew what made a boat tip and what kept it upright. He knew the relationship between beam width and roll resistance, between draft and maneuverability. He needed something simple, reliable, built from materials he had or could get cheap. He settled on a John boat design, flat-bottomed, wide beam, plywood construction over a lumber frame. It wouldn't win prizes for aesthetics, but it would float, and it would hold. The design called for a 4-foot beam, maximum stability in moving water, with enough freeboard to handle waves or wake from debris. He calculated the displacement carefully, accounting for 6 adults plus supplies, roughly 1,500 pounds total. The hull would need to displace at least 2,000 pounds of water to maintain safe freeboard, which meant approximately 32 cubic feet of submerged volume. The math checked out. He drew the lines, measured twice, marked the cut points. He started cutting lumber the next morning after the milking. 2x4s for the frame, 3/4-inch marine plywood for the hull and sides. He worked in the shed with the door half open, the sound of the saw echoing across the yard. The smell of fresh-cut pine filled the space, sharp and clean, mixing with the older smells of motor oil and rust. Linda came out around noon, stood in the doorway, arms crossed against the cold. "What are you building?" she asked. "A boat," Robert said, not looking up from his work. "For what?" she asked. "Just in case," he said. "Just in case what?" she pressed. "In case the river keeps rising," Robert said. "In case we need a way out." Linda shook her head slowly, her expression somewhere between concern and frustration. "We don't need a boat," she said. "The river's not going to come up here. It never has. Robert said there's always a first time." Linda said he was wasting time and money they didn't have. The farm was tight this year, feed costs up, milk prices down. Every dollar mattered. The plywood alone had cost $200, money that could have gone toward fixing the fence or replacing the aging water pump or a dozen other things that needed attention. Robert didn't argue. He just kept measuring, kept cutting. The frame pieces lay on the floor, numbered in chalk, waiting for assembly. When Linda walked away, he heard her muttering something about stubbornness, about men who couldn't let go of worst-case scenarios, about how she'd married someone practical, but somewhere along the line, he'd turned into someone who saw danger everywhere. When Frank showed up that afternoon to check on the herd, he wandered over to the shed, curious about the noise. He saw the frame taking shape and laughed, a short bark of amusement. "You planning to sail to town?" he asked. Robert said no, just being prepared. Frank said, "Prepared for what? The river's miles from here, always has been." He walked away, shaking his head. Robert heard him later, talking to Linda in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the open window. Frank said Robert was building a boat like some kind of prepper, wasting time on paranoia, letting fear dictate decisions. Linda agreed, said she'd tried to talk sense into him, but he wouldn't listen. That once Robert got an idea in his head, there was no shaking it loose. Robert kept working, fitting the frame joints, checking angles with a carpenter's square, making sure everything was true. The conversation outside faded into background noise, just another sound in the constant hum of farm life. The work became a routine. Robert would finish the morning chores, then spend 3 or 4 hours in the shed before heading back to the barn for the evening milking. He built the frame first, cross-bracing it with care, making sure every joint was square, every screw seated properly, every connection solid. He'd learned carpentry from his uncle, summers spent building docks and repair sheds, and he knew that shortcuts showed up later, usually when you couldn't afford them. The frame went together in sections, bow, stern, midship. He bolted them together, reinforcing the joints with metal brackets, creating a skeleton that was rigid but not brittle. The structure had to be strong enough to resist flexing in waves, but light enough to move quickly if needed. He achieved this by using a longitudinal stringer system, 3 long 2x4s running the length of the hull, tied into the cross frames every 18 inches. The geometry distributed stress evenly, preventing weak points, ensuring that impact loads would spread across the structure rather than concentrating at failure points. The plywood went on next, cut to fit, edges sealed with marine epoxy before screwing them down. He worked methodically, checking and rechecking. Each sheet had to overlap properly, each seam had to be waterproof. He applied the epoxy with a brush, working it into the wood grain, building up a barrier against moisture. The chemical smell was strong, sharp in his nose, giving him a faint headache, but he kept at it. The epoxy took 12 hours to cure fully, so he worked in stages, sealing one section while another dried. Jacob came out once, watched for a few minutes, and asked why he was bothering. Robert said it was good to have options. Jacob said it looked like a waste, that the river wasn't going anywhere, that Dad was overreacting like he always did. Robert said maybe, but he'd rather build it and not need it than need it and not have it. Jacob said that was stupid logic. You could justify anything with that reasoning. Robert didn't respond. Jacob went back inside. Robert heard him later, on the phone with a friend, laughing about his dad building a boat in a landlocked valley, like some kind of crazy person preparing for the apocalypse. The words stung, but Robert kept working. He'd been called worse things for being cautious. The river kept rising. By mid-November, it had breached the lowest sections of the levee on the far side, flooding a few fields that belonged to the neighbors downstream. The water spread across farmland, turning fields into shallow lakes, destroying late-season crops. The county sent out a notice voluntary evacuation for areas within a quarter-mile of the river. Robert's property sat just outside that line, technically safe according to the maps. But Robert knew maps were drawn by people who hadn't walked the land, hadn't seen how water pooled after heavy rain, hadn't noticed the subtle slope that guided runoff towards certain low spots. The maps showed flood zones based on historical data, but history was changing. The weather was changing. The old patterns didn't hold anymore. Rainfall that used to be once-in-a-century events were happening every few years. The models were wrong because they were based on assumptions that no longer applied. He kept building. The boat took shape, hull complete, sides rising, a simple bench seat across the middle for stability. The design was coming together exactly as he'd envisioned, functional and ugly but sound. He added flotation, sealed plastic jugs strapped under the seats just in case. 8 one-gallon jugs, 4 on each side, providing an additional 60 pounds of buoyancy if the hull took on water. He rigged a pair of oarlocks, heavy-duty marine grade, bolted through the gunnels with backing plates to prevent tearing under strain. He cut 2 sturdy oars from scrap lumber, 8 feet long, balanced and sanded smooth. The blades were wide, designed to catch water efficiently, to generate thrust against current. He tested the balance by holding each oar at the locking point, making sure it didn't tip too far forward or back, adjusting until the weight distribution was perfect. The whole thing weighed maybe 300 pounds, light enough to move with help, heavy enough to stay put in current. Liam asked him one evening, while they were stacking hay bales in the barn, if he really thought the river would come that far. Robert paused, looked out toward the dark line of trees that marked the river's edge, and said he didn't know. But the rain hadn't stopped in 6 weeks, and upstream the reservoirs were full, and when reservoirs filled, they had to release water, controlled releases they called them, and that water had to go somewhere. It didn't just disappear. It flowed downstream, adding to the volume already in the system. Liam said the levees would hold. Everyone said so. The county said so. The engineers said so. Robert said levees were built by the lowest bidder 50 years ago and maintained by a county that barely had a budget for road salt, let alone comprehensive infrastructure inspection. Liam didn't respond, just kept stacking bales, but Robert could see him thinking about it, could see the doubt creeping in. That night Robert painted the boat's hull, 2 coats of waterproof sealant, and let it cure under heat lamps. The paint went on thick, grey and industrial, sealing every gap, every seam. He inspected his work under bright light, looking for imperfections, finding none. The boat was ready. The principle was simple, older than civilization. Water always wins. You could build walls, dig channels, raise foundations, but water found the weak point, the low spot, the crack in the seal. Robert had watched it all his life, the way spring melt carved new gullies in the hillside, the way a clogged drain could flood a barn floor in minutes, the way ice expansion could crack concrete foundations. Water was patient. Water was relentless. The river wasn't malicious, it was just water obeying gravity, following pressure gradients, seeking equilibrium. And right now, equilibrium meant more water than the system could hold. The levees were designed for a 100-year flood, a term that meant a 1% chance in any given year. But that calculation assumed stable climate, consistent rainfall patterns, predictable snowmelt. Those assumptions no longer held. The 100-year flood was starting to look like the 10-year flood, maybe even the 5-year flood. Robert didn't need a degree in hydrology to see it. He just needed to pay attention to what was happening, to read the signs, to trust what the land was telling him. He explained this once to Frank, standing by the fence line, watching the river churn brown and angry in the distance. Frank listened, then shook his head. "You're overthinking it," he said. "The county knows what they're doing. They've got engineers, experts, people who study this stuff for a living." Robert said the experts designed the system 40 years ago, using data from 80 years ago. And the world had changed since then. The climate had shifted. The rainfall patterns were different. The snowpack melted earlier and faster. Frank said the world always changes, but the river stays the same. It always has. Robert pointed to the waterline, already 10 feet higher than it should be for this time of year, and said the river was telling them something. Frank looked, frowned, but then shrugged and said it would go back down. It always did. He walked away, unconvinced. That evening, at another family dinner, Claire mentioned Robert's boat to the others, laughing about it like it was a hobby project, something eccentric to humor him about. Jacob joined in, making jokes about Noah's Ark, about preparing for 40 days and 40 nights, about gathering 2 of every animal. Linda smiled but said nothing, which somehow felt worse than if she'd joined in. Robert ate in silence, feeling the weight of their dismissal, the certainty they had that he was wrong, that he was wasting his time, that he was letting anxiety drive him to irrational action. He finished the boat on November 20th. It sat in the shed, ready, 12 feet of practical engineering that looked rough but functional. He rigged a tarp cover, waterproof and tied down tight, and added supplies underneath sealed in waterproof bags, flashlights with extra batteries, first aid kit with bandages and antiseptic, emergency blanket rated for sub-zero temperatures, water purification tablets, a hand-crank radio that didn't need batteries, 50 feet of nylon rope rated for 500 pounds, a fixed blade knife with a serrated edge, matches in a waterproof container, protein bars with a 5-year shelf life, bottles of water. He told Linda it was done. She looked at it, looked at him, and said she hoped he felt better now that he'd built his ark. Her tone wasn't cruel, just tired, resigned. Frank came by, saw the finished boat, and said Robert had watched too many disaster movies, that Hollywood had gotten into his head. Claire stopped over with groceries and made a joke about naming it, suggesting the USS Paranoia. Robert smiled thinly, said nothing, and went back to work. He had other preparations to make, other contingencies to plan for. He started inventorying the property, identifying what could be moved quickly and what would have to be left behind. The livestock was the biggest concern. The dairy herd couldn't evacuate in a boat. 23 cows, each weighing over 1,000 pounds. If the water came, they'd have to be moved to higher ground beforehand, assuming there was warning, assuming there was time. He scouted the area, walking the property boundaries and beyond, looking for elevated ground. He found a ridge half a mile east that sat 50 feet above the valley floor, well above any conceivable floodline. He cleared brush, made a path the herd could follow, set up temporary fencing using posts and wire he'd salvaged. He did this alone over 3 days, working before dawn and after dark, using a headlamp when the sun went down. No one asked what he was doing. They'd stopped paying attention to his preparations, dismissed them as obsession, as the fixation of someone who couldn't let go of an irrational fear. The first test came on November 23rd. The rain intensified, a front stalling over the valley, dumping 2 inches in 6 hours. Robert woke to the sound of water running hard through the drainage ditch behind the barn, a sound like constant traffic, white noise that filled the darkness. He pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight and walked the property line. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating sheets of water falling from the sky. The lower pasture had pooled, ankle-deep water reflecting his light, turning the field into a mirror. The creek that fed into the river had jumped its banks, spreading across the access road. When he reached the main road, he saw water flowing over the asphalt, not deep, just a few inches, but moving with purpose, carrying gravel and debris. He waded through it, felt the current tugging at his boots, and estimated the flow rate at maybe 500 gallons per minute. That was significant. That was dangerous. That was a sign of system overload. He walked back, checking the route from the shed to the house, memorizing obstacles, measuring distances in his head. The yard had become a shallow lake, water pooling around the foundation, testing the seal, looking for ways in. The basement would be taking on water already. He'd have to pump it out later. By dawn, the water had receded slightly, enough that the road was passable again, but the ground remained saturated, muddy, unstable. Frank called it a close one, said they'd dodged a bullet. Linda said, "See, the river's still far away, we're fine, nothing to worry about." Robert looked south toward the river and saw the water line had climbed higher, closer, maybe a quarter mile now instead of half a mile. The gaps between the farm and the flood zone had shrunk. He calculated the distance, the elevation drop, the time it would take for water to reach them if the levee broke. Minutes, not hours. Maybe 10 minutes if the breach was upstream. Maybe 30 if it was downstream. Not enough time to evacuate without a plan, without preparation, without something already in place. He started moving the boat that afternoon. He couldn't bring it to the house without causing a scene, without inviting more ridicule. So he positioned it halfway, near the old equipment shed, covered and ready. He cleared a path, tested the rollers he'd built to move it quickly if needed. Steel pipes, 6 inches in diameter, laid parallel, spaced 2 feet apart. The boat could roll on them, reducing friction, allowing 2 people to move what would otherwise take 6. Basic physics, leverage and friction reduction. He rehearsed the steps in his head. Uncover, roll, launch. He timed it with a stopwatch. 5 minutes from shed to water's edge if the water came that far. He also checked the roads, marked alternate routes in case the main road flooded, in case the primary evacuation route was blocked. He drew maps, laminated them using clear packing tape, kept copies in his truck and in the house. He assembled go bags for each family member, placed them in the mudroom, and told everyone where they were. Linda asked what they were for. Robert said emergencies. She said what kind of emergencies. He said any kind. Flood, fire, storm, anything that required quick evacuation. She sighed and walked away, and he heard her telling Claire on the phone later that Robert was getting worse, that the paranoia was taking over, that she didn't know what to do about it. The weather report that night mentioned the possibility of sustained rain through the end of the month. The reservoirs were at capacity, and controlled releases were scheduled to begin within 48 hours. Robert did the math. Sustained rain plus reservoir release plus saturated ground equaled rising water, likely fast, likely unstoppable once it started. The system had no more capacity. The buffer was gone. He mentioned it again at dinner, suggested they think about moving some valuables to higher ground, maybe packing a go-bag, maybe having a plan. Linda sighed heavily. Frank said the county would warn them if it was serious, that emergency management had systems in place, sirens and alerts and procedures. Claire said Robert was stressing everyone out, that the constant worry was worse than any flood. Liam said his friend's family downstream wasn't worried, so why should they be? What did Robert know that professional emergency managers didn't? Robert dropped it, but he spent the evening loading the truck with essentials, tying down tarps, making sure the fuel tanks were full, topping off the generator, checking the oil, testing the spark plug. He filled water containers, stacked them in the shed. He moved important documents to waterproof storage, elevated above potential flood levels, birth certificates, insurance papers, deeds, everything that would be impossible to replace. Jacob found him in the barn late that night, organizing tools, sorting them by priority, packing the essential ones in waterproof cases. "What are you doing?" Jacob asked. "Getting ready," Robert said. "For what?" Jacob asked. "For whatever comes," Robert said. Jacob said nothing was coming, that Robert was being paranoid, that this was getting out of hand. Robert stopped working, turned to face his son, and asked if paranoia kept you alive. Was it still paranoia, or was it just preparation? Jacob didn't have an answer. He stood there for a moment, then shook his head and left. Robert continued working, methodical, thorough, checking every detail. He knew he looked obsessive. He didn't care. He'd rather be wrong and ready than right and helpless. He'd rather face ridicule than face disaster unprepared. The false positive came on November 27th. The sirens went off at 4 in the morning, the emergency broadcast system crackling to life on every phone and radio in the county. Flood warning, immediate evacuation advised for low-lying areas. The mechanical voice repeated the message 3 times, urgent and impersonal. Robert was up in seconds, adrenaline flooding his system, waking Linda, shouting for the boys. They stumbled downstairs, confused, half asleep, trying to process what was happening. Robert told them to grab clothes, shoes, anything important, to move now, no time to waste. Frank's truck pulled into the yard, headlights sweeping across the rain, tires spraying water. He skidded to a stop, jumped out, and ran to the porch. Claire arrived a minute later, panicked, soaking wet, eyes wide. They all stood in the kitchen, listening to the sirens, the rain, the wind rattling the windows. Robert said they needed to move. Now, the river must have breached. They needed to go. Frank said, "Hold on, let me check," pulling out his phone. He pulled up the county website, scrolled through the emergency notices, and showed Robert the screen. The warning was for areas south and east of the river, the opposite side from their farm. A secondary levee had given way, flooding a neighborhood near town, but their farm wasn't in the danger zone. The sirens were precautionary, county-wide, standard protocol for any levee breach. Linda let out a breath, hand on her chest. Claire said, "Jesus Christ, Robert, you scared us half to death." Jacob said this is exactly what he meant, overreacting, jumping at shadows. Liam stood by the door, silent, watching his father, and Robert saw something in his expression, maybe doubt, maybe embarrassment. Frank clapped him on the shoulder, said, "It's good to be cautious, but let's not lose our heads. Let's stay calm." They went back to bed. Robert stayed up, sitting at the kitchen table, watching the rain through the window, feeling the doubt creep in. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was seeing threats that weren't there. Maybe the boat was unnecessary, the preparations excessive, the warnings misplaced. He poured coffee, sat in the darkness, and stared out at nothing. But the river didn't stop. The controlled releases began 2 days later, and the water surged. Robert watched the level climb, steady and relentless, swallowing the far bank, creeping into the lower pasture, advancing toward the fence line like something alive, something purposeful. The drainage ditches overflowed, water pooling in the yard, soaking into the foundation, seeping through cracks. He checked the boat, secured the supplies, tightened the tarp, and waited. The rain continued, heavier now, a deluge that drummed against the roof. turned the driveway into a stream, washed out the gravel near the barn. The sound was constant, overwhelming, a white noise that filled every space, making conversation difficult, making sleep impossible. The power flickered once, twice, then died with a final surge that took out the lights and the heat and everything electric in the house. The house went dark. Robert lit candles, started the generator, and tried the phone. No signal. The cell towers were down, either flooded or overloaded or both. They were cut off. The radio still worked, running on batteries, and Robert listened to the emergency broadcasts. The river was at record levels. Multiple levee failures reported across the county. Evacuations underway in 3 towns. The county was advising residents in flood-prone areas to seek higher ground immediately, to avoid travel, to shelter in place if evacuation wasn't possible. He looked at Linda. She looked back, and he saw the fear in her eyes, the realization beginning to dawn. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Robert went to the window, looked out at the yard, and saw the water creeping closer. Visible progress. The kind of rise that meant the system had failed somewhere upstream. That pressure was building, that the flood was coming. He called to Jacob and Liam, told them to get their things, told them it was time. They moved quickly. No arguments now, grabbing bags, pulling on coats, faces pale. Frank appeared at the door, knocking hard, urgency in every movement. Robert let him in. Claire was with him, shaking, crying. Frank said his house was flooding, water coming through the basement, rising fast, everything ruined. Robert nodded. He'd expected this. He told them to stay close, to be ready to move. He went to the shed, started pulling the boat toward the house, calling for Jacob and Liam to help. The real disaster arrived on the night of November 30th. Robert woke to a sound like thunder, low and continuous, but it wasn't thunder. It was water, moving in volume, a roar that grew louder as he came fully awake, vibrating through the walls, through the floor, through his bones. He grabbed the flashlight, ran downstairs, and threw open the front door. The yard was gone. Water stretched from the barn to the fence line to the road beyond, 3 feet deep and rising, black and churning, lit by the weak glow of the generator light. He saw debris tumbling past, tree branches as thick as his arm, fence posts still trailing wire, something that looked like a shed roof flipped upside down. The river had broken through, not just risen, but broken its banks entirely, cut through the levee, carved a new channel through the fields, and that channel ran straight through their property. The levee had failed, catastrophically. Somewhere upstream the wall had given way, and millions of gallons were pouring into the valley, following the path of least resistance, following the old riverbed his father had shown him on those maps, the path that memory told the water to follow. He shouted for Linda, for the boy's voice raw. They came downstairs, saw the water through the open door and froze. The reality of it hit them all at once, the impossible made real. Frank's house sat lower, closer to the source, and Robert knew it was already gone, swallowed. Robert grabbed his radio, tried to reach Frank, got only static. He told Linda to get everyone dressed. Warm clothes, boots, coats, layers, everything they'd need. She moved. No questions now, just action. Her hands shaking but purposeful. Liam and Jacob pulled on jackets, hands shaking, faces white. Robert ran to the shed, splashing through water that was now mid-calf, cold and fast, so cold it burned. The current pulled at him, trying to knock him down, trying to sweep him away. He braced against it, pushed forward, fighting every step. The boat was where he'd left it, covered, ready, exactly as he'd planned. He ripped off the tarp, checked the hull by flashlight, and started pulling it toward the house. The rollers worked, the boat moving smoothly over the pipes, but the current fought him, trying to twist the boat sideways, trying to flip it. He braced, heaved, and got it moving. Jacob appeared beside him, then Liam, and together they dragged it up the slope to the porch, water now waist-deep, rising by the minute, rising faster than seemed possible. Frank's truck came roaring up the drive, water spraying from the wheels, engine screaming, pushing through the flood. He skidded to a stop, jumped out, and ran to the porch, water up to his knees. His house was flooding, he shouted over the roar. Water coming in through the doors, through the windows, rising fast, everything ruined, everything gone. Claire was with him, soaked and shaking, crying, mascara running down her face. Robert told them to get in the boat now, no time. Frank stared at it, at Robert, And for a second Robert saw the disbelief shatter, saw the realization hit, saw everything he'd said dismissed and ignored suddenly validated in the worst possible way. Frank nodded, grabbed Claire's arm, and helped her in. Linda climbed in next, then Jacob, then Liam. The boat rocked under the weight but held steady. Robert pushed off from the porch, the boat sliding into the current, and jumped in, grabbing the oars. The current seized them immediately, spinning the boat, pulling them toward the darkness, toward the main channel, toward destruction if he lost control. Robert dug the oars in, fighting for control, every muscle straining, angling toward higher ground. The boat rocked violently, water sloshing over the sides, but it held. The flotation kept them stable, the wide beam resisted tipping, and the sealed hull kept them dry enough. Everything he'd built, every detail he'd worried over, every choice he'd second-guessed was working. He pulled hard, muscles burning, shoulders screaming, guiding them past the barn, past the fence line, toward the ridge that marked the edge of the flood zone. Behind them, the house disappeared into the water, the porch submerged, the first-floor windows glowing faintly before the generator died, and everything went black. Linda gripped the sides, knuckles white, not speaking. Frank held Claire, both of them silent, staring at the water, at what they were losing. Jacob and Liam sat close, faces pale, eyes wide, looking at their father like they'd never really seen him before, like they were seeing him for the first time. Debris hit them twice, heavy impacts that rocked the boat, thuds that echoed through the hull, but the construction held, the plywood didn't breach, the frame didn't crack. Robert steered around the worst of it, navigating by flashlight held between his teeth, by memory, by instinct, by sheer desperate focus. The water was black, opaque, hiding everything beneath the surface. He had no idea what they were floating over. Fences, maybe. The driveway, the lower pasture where the cows had been. His mind tried to map it, to place their location, but the familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by the flood, erased. He just kept rowing, kept fighting. The ridge grew closer, a dark line against the sky, higher ground, safety. He aimed for it, pulled harder, felt the current weaken as they moved into shallower water, the boat slowing, responding better to the oars. The boat scraped bottom once, twice, grinding against submerged obstacles, then held. They'd reached solid ground. They reached the gravel road 15 minutes after launching, though it felt like hours, like days. Robert collapsed forward, chest heaving, hands cramping, every muscle on fire. Around him, his family sat in silence, staring back at the water, at the farm that was now an inland sea, at everything they'd known transformed into something alien and hostile. Frank spoke first, his voice hoarse, barely audible over the rain. "You built this," he said. "Yeah," Robert managed. Frank shook his head, not in dismissal, but in something else. Awe, maybe. Or shame. "You knew," Frank said. Robert said he didn't know, he just prepared, he just paid attention. Linda reached over, touched his arm, squeezed, and her hand was cold, but her grip was firm. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have listened. I should have helped." Claire started crying, quiet sobs that shook her shoulders, and she kept saying, "I'm sorry," over and over. Jacob and Liam sat close, faces pale, eyes wide, and Jacob said, "Dad, I'm sorry." And Liam just nodded, unable to speak. They stayed on the ridge through the night, huddled in the boat under the tarp, waiting for dawn, waiting for the rain to stop, waiting to see what remained. The temperature dropped. Robert used the emergency blanket, the silver space blanket he'd packed, wrapped it around Claire, who was shaking uncontrollably, her core temperature dropping. Frank stayed quiet, staring at the water, at where his house used to be. Linda held Robert's hand, squeezed it periodically, and he squeezed back. Jacob asked, voice small and young, if their house was gone. Robert said he didn't know, they'd have to wait for daylight to see, but probably yes. Liam asked if everyone else was okay, the neighbors, the other families downstream. Robert said he hoped so. He said the county would be sending help, rescue crews, helicopters if the weather broke, that they just needed to stay put and stay warm and wait for morning. The proof came with daylight. When the rain finally stopped and the water began to recede, they walked back. The sun rose pale and cold, revealing the devastation in stages, like a curtain slowly lifting on a scene of total destruction. Frank's house was destroyed, completely, utterly. The roof had collapsed inward, walls buckled and torn away, the foundation exposed and cracked. Everything inside was ruined, furniture scattered across the fields, belongings destroyed by water and mud. There was nothing left to salvage. The main house had flooded to the second floor, furniture floating in the rooms, drywall sagging and waterlogged, everything ruined. The smell was overwhelming, mud and sewage and decay. The barn had held, barely, the structure intact, but the interior destroyed. The equipment was underwater, the feed spoiled and rotting, the herd scattered or drowned. Robert found 5 cows dead in the lower pasture, drowned where they'd been trapped by rising water, unable to reach higher ground. His boat sat on the ridge where they'd left it, scratched and dented but intact, functional. The thing that had saved them. The neighbors downstream had lost everything. Robert learned this over the following days as rescue crews arrived and information filtered in. 3 families had been evacuated by helicopter after their roofs became islands, plucked from the peak of their homes by Coast Guard crews. One man, a farmer Robert knew slightly from the feed store, had tried to drive out and drowned when his truck stalled in the current. His body was found 2 days later, a mile downstream, still strapped into the driver's seat, eyes open. 4 other people were missing, presumed dead, swept away by the flood. The county declared a state of emergency. The governor toured the damage by helicopter and promised aid. The news crews arrived, filming the devastation, interviewing survivors, broadcasting images of the destruction to the world. The reversal happened slowly, over days and weeks, in small moments and quiet conversations. Frank helped Robert salvage what they could, working side by side without speaking much, but the dynamic had changed completely. The judgment was gone, replaced by something quieter. Respect, maybe, or regret, or both. He'd stopped making jokes about the boat. He'd stopped questioning Robert's instincts. Instead, he asked questions. What should we do next? How should we rebuild? What should we watch for? Should we stay, or should we move somewhere else? Linda stopped questioning his instincts entirely, started asking what he thought they should do next, deferring to his judgment in ways she never had before. She began keeping her own eye on the weather reports, marking water levels in a notebook, taking preparation seriously, understanding what it meant. Claire apologized repeatedly, said she'd been wrong to laugh, wrong to dismiss him, that she'd never doubted anyone's judgment so badly in her life. And she'd carry that lesson forward, that she'd never ignore someone's warnings again. Jacob and Liam didn't say much, but Robert saw them watching him differently, listening when he spoke, asking questions, wanting to learn what he knew. Jacob started helping with the preparations for the next flood, asking to learn about water dynamics, about structural engineering, about risk assessment. Liam spent hours studying the old maps, trying to understand what Robert had seen, trying to develop the same instinct for reading the land. The insurance adjusters came, took photos, filed reports, made promises. The payout would cover maybe half the damage if they were lucky, if the company didn't find some clause to deny coverage. The county sent engineers to assess the levee failure. They found that the structure had been compromised for years, cracks in the foundation, erosion undermining the base, vegetation growth weakening the structure, maintenance deferred due to budget cuts year after year. Multiple inspection reports had flagged concerns, but funding had never materialized for repairs. The failure had been predictable, inevitable, just a matter of when, not if. The engineers wrote their reports. The county promised reforms, promised funding, promised accountability. Nothing changed. The bureaucracy ground on. The river eventually settled back into its banks, but the damage remained, a scar across the valley, a permanent mark. Families moved away. Businesses closed. The school lost 30 students. The community that had existed before the flood was gone, replaced by something smaller, more cautious, more aware of what could be lost. Robert spent December rebuilding. Not the house, not yet. That would take months, maybe years. That would require money they didn't have. But the pieces they needed to function. He repaired the barn, patched the roof, replaced the ruined feed, rebuilt the stalls. He salvaged the generator, stripped it down, cleaned every part, replaced the damaged components, got it running again. He moved the family into the upper floor of the barn temporarily, setting up cots, a camp stove, a makeshift living space that was cramped and uncomfortable but livable. They made it work. The boat stayed nearby, cleaned and maintained, still ready, because the rain forecasts for January looked heavy, and the river had proven it could surprise them, that it could exceed every prediction, that it couldn't be trusted. Frank helped, working every day, and so did the boys, and together they learned to read the signs, to trust preparation over assumption, to respect the power of water. They installed water-level gauges along the property line, checked them daily, kept logs. They mapped evacuation routes, practiced loading the boat under time constraints, ran drills. They built a second boat, larger, capable of carrying livestock, crude but functional. They would not be caught unprepared again. That was the promise they made to themselves, the lesson written in blood and mud and loss. The aftermath taught them what denial cost, what it meant in concrete terms, in dollars and lives and futures. 3 families lost their homes entirely, structures reduced to rubble and debris scattered across miles of farmland. The county declared the area a disaster zone, but aid was slow, tangled in bureaucracy, caught up in paperwork and approval processes and budget limitations. Federal relief took weeks to arrive, and when it did, the amounts were insufficient, the rules arbitrary, the application process Byzantine. Robert's family survived because he'd acted when no one believed him, because he'd built something practical when it looked unnecessary, when it looked paranoid, when it invited ridicule. The lesson wasn't lost on the community. Neighbors started asking him questions, stopping by the barn wanting to know how high to build, what to stock, where to go if it happened again. Robert answered them, shared what he knew, helped where he could, never saying "I told you so," never making them feel worse than they already did. He taught them how to read water levels, how to calculate flood risk using simple math and observation, how to build emergency shelters from salvaged materials. He showed them his boat, explained the design choices, the principles behind the construction, why it worked when it needed to. Some listened carefully, took notes, started their own preparations. Some didn't, still clinging to the belief that it was a once-in-a-lifetime event, that lightning wouldn't strike twice. But the dynamic had changed. Robert was no longer the paranoid outlier. He was the man who'd been right. The valley would recover, but it would recover differently, with more eyes on the river, more respect for what water could do, more understanding of how quickly safety could turn to disaster. New building codes were proposed at county meetings, requiring elevated foundations, flood-resistant materials, minimum distances from water sources. The county promised to repair the levees, to conduct regular inspections, to allocate proper funding for maintenance. Whether those promises would be kept remained to be seen. Robert didn't trust promises anymore. Promises were words, and words didn't stop floods. He trusted preparation. He trusted concrete action, measurable outcomes, systems that worked when tested. He trusted what he could see and touch and verify himself. One evening in late January, Robert walked down to the river, stood at the edge, and watched the current. It flowed steady, calm, back within its normal boundaries, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't destroyed lives and homes and futures just weeks before. But he knew what it could become, how quickly it could turn from a ribbon into a flood, from a boundary into a weapon. He thought about the boat, still sitting under its tarp near the barn, cleaned and maintained and ready. He thought about his family, how close they'd come, how thin the margin had been between survival and drowning. 5 minutes either way, and they might not have made it. 5 minutes of hesitation, of doubt, of listening to the voices that said he was overreacting. The recurring detail he'd noticed that first morning, the radio on the workbench sat there still, its red light glowing in the gathering dusk, tuned to the weather station. He'd listened to it every morning since September, tracking every front, every warning, every shift in the forecast. It had become habit, a small act of vigilance that kept them informed, kept them ahead of the curve, gave them the minutes they needed when those minutes mattered most. That red light was a constant reminder of what attention could prevent, what preparation could achieve, what the cost of ignoring warnings could be. He walked back to the barn as the sun dropped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the water-stained fields. The land still bore the marks, vegetation crushed and dying, soil composition changed by the sediment deposits, the normal patterns of growth disrupted. It would take years for the land to recover fully. Linda met him at the barn door, handed him a cup of coffee, and said the contractors had given them a timeline for the house, 8 months if everything went right, longer if there were complications. Robert nodded, said that was fine. They'd make do. They'd survived worse. Frank joined them, sitting on an upturned bucket, and said he'd been thinking about building something himself, a platform maybe, elevated storage, something they could move to if the water came back. Robert said that was smart, really smart, and he'd help design it, help build it. They sat together in the fading light, 3 people who'd learned the hard way that preparation wasn't paranoia. It was survival. It was the difference between living and dying. The conversation drifted to other topics: repairs needed, supplies to order, plans for spring planting if the soil recovered enough. But underneath it all was the shared knowledge, the understanding that they'd survived because one person had refused to ignore the evidence, had trusted observation over consensus, had chosen action over comfort. The open thread remained, subtle but present, woven into the fabric of their new normal. The weather patterns that had caused the flood hadn't resolved. They'd shifted, become the new baseline. The forecasts for the coming year showed more volatility, more rain, more extreme events, more uncertainty. The climate scientists talked about atmospheric rivers, about jet stream disruptions, about feedback loops that were accelerating faster than the models predicted. The river would rise again, maybe not this year, maybe not next, but eventually. Water always came back. Pressure always built. Systems always failed when pushed past their limits. And when it did, Robert would be ready. His family would be ready. They'd learned to listen, to prepare, to respect the forces they couldn't control. The boat would stay under its tarp, maintained and inspected and ready, a symbol of the choice Robert had made, the one his family had ignored until the river proved him right, until the water came and swept away their certainty and their comfortable assumptions. The valley rebuilt slowly, house by house, field by field. But the mindset had changed fundamentally. People checked forecasts obsessively now, watched water levels with religious attention, kept supplies ready, maintained evacuation plans. Robert's story spread beyond the immediate community, picked up by regional news, then national media, becoming a cautionary tale and a lesson, told in kitchens and at county meetings and in emergency management training sessions. The man who built a boat when no one believed him, who saved his family because he trusted his instincts over consensus, who understood that survival often came down to one decision, made early, against resistance, when it still mattered, when there was still time to act. Robert stood in the barn doorway as winter deepened, watching snow fall across the fields, covering the scars the flood had left, whitewashing the evidence, but not erasing it. The snow wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't bring back what was lost. But it was beautiful in its way, peaceful, a reminder that nature wasn't always destructive, that water could be gentle as well as violent. The radio crackled on the workbench, the weather report cycling through its familiar rhythm, temperature and precipitation, and wind patterns. He'd check it again tomorrow, same as he had every day since the river came, same as he would every day for the rest of his life. Because the cost of being wrong was too high, and the value of being prepared was everything. He'd proven that. His family knew it now, and that knowledge, hard-earned and undeniable, written in loss and survival, and the thin margin between them, would shape every decision they made going forward. The river had taught them respect for forces larger than themselves. Robert had taught them vigilance, the value of observation, the importance of trusting evidence over comfort. Together, those lessons formed a foundation that would keep them alive, that would help them navigate whatever came next, whatever disasters the changing world would bring. Because the flood was over, but the story wasn't finished. The river still flowed south through the valley, patient and powerful and waiting. And Robert would be watching, listening to that red light glowing in the darkness, ready for the day when the water rose again.